private sector and generated by citizens. Before I start talking about the experimental work we've been doing in Uganda and Somalia, I just want to ask the audience, who knows what big data is? Raise your hand. No shame. Okay, quite good, yeah. So there are many ways, let me just tell you something about big data then. So there are many ways of defining it, and the definition is changing. So a way to define big data is data that is generated by people when they do or when they talk, and they do this linked to a digital device. So every time you do something and there is a digital device, or you say something, there is a data bit that is generated. Now, this is called big data. Another way to approach the definition of big data is by the receptors of big data. So mobile phones, for example, sensors, satellites, etc. I have my own definition now, and it's big data. It's more, from my experience, defined by the methods that are needed to analyze it. So basically, it's not a small data. And what is a small data? A small data normally fits in an Excel file or SPS file. Big data doesn't fit, okay? So while the official definition is that it's data that is produced very, very, very fast, that is unstructured, and that is very volatile, I think that now we're becoming very flexible. And with the introduction of artificial intelligence, my personal view is that now we are transforming reality into big data bits. Because satellite imagery, and I'm a geographer, has never been a source of big data. And now everywhere, in every conference, there's people saying big data with satellite imagery. Well, it's not. But the way we treat satellite imagery with artificial intelligence can make it a big data source. We are transforming the traditional imagery from the satellites into a source of big data. Now, over the last years in Kampala, we've been working on experimenting. Hey, okay. So I was talking about satellite imagery. Here it is. So, for example, this is satellite imagery, okay? What you see here is experimentation process to build a tool to do automatic identification of elements. Basically, if the eye can see it, the machine can see it. If the eye can recognize an element, the machine can do it. So automatic identification, then, as we are saying, we are transforming reality into a big data source. This is work we are doing with UNOSAT for the automatic mapping of refugee settlements for emergencies. But I'm not going to talk about this. This was just an example. I'm going to talk to you about the work we've done to support, to explore the use of big data for conflict prevention and for peace building. And before I explain you the work, I just introduce you to this. This is the guidance notes on the big data for achievement, the 2030 agenda. This is a guidance note developed by UN DOC and UN Global Pulse that guides the work of the UN in dealing with big data. So there are privacy and protection principles. There is a risk assessment tool, and we have used all that before starting experimenting. Now, the work we've been doing on SDG 16. Why on SDG 16 in the areas of conflict prevention and peace building? Because there are new data needs. The new types of war, conflict, and violence are challenging the traditional ways of doing analysis to support peace and security efforts. So new types of war, new types of conflict, new analysis needs, new data needs. That was our premise of starting the work. We need to monitor contexts as they evolve in order to do early warning for conflicts to escalate. And my personal perspective, having been doing a lot of years of analysis inside the UN system, is that a small data analysis has limitations. What limitations? Well, some cases, when we try to take the pulse of people with surveys, these surveys are very costly, are very lengthy, and when we have the results, the pulse might have changed, okay? Also, security constraints in post-conflict areas or areas that are with instability impose a lot of restrictions into analysis And I was based in Afghanistan over 2 years, so I'm speaking from practical experience on this. So basically, the security constraints don't allow personnel to go out to the field. So you can see the quality of the analysis in these cases is questionable also. So new types of data and new methods are needed. That was the first reason. The second reason, because new data is available. This big data thing is just data, but it's new, it's different, and it's available. So new data needs and new data available. That's why we decided to give it a try and to experiment and do some work. So I'm going to present the work we've done in Uganda and in Somalia. Very experimental. I was very happy to receive this invitation to present the experimentation process because nobody ever asks you for that. Everybody wants to see the results. What are the results, you know? So we really experimented. In Uganda, it's been 3 years of work now. In Somalia, it's been 1 year of work. And what was our hypothesis to start the work? We said, okay, if private sector is using social media mining to gain insights for product development, for marketing campaigns, to understand better the customers, what about we use it for conflict prevention? We give it a try. Maybe there's nothing there, but maybe there is. So we work to build the technology for doing data mining from social media, public Facebook groups, and then public radio discussions. And I insist, public. It happens many times that when I finish the presentation, somebody says, but can you analyze my Facebook page? No, it's public, okay? So you should know if you're in a public Facebook group, okay? It's different. And the same with radio. We have never analyzed any private radio channel, but public radio discussions. So we decided to test it. And what we realized in Somalia is the following. In Somalia, we work with peace building mission and with UNDP, and we analyze content of 2,500 Facebook groups. Here is the big dimension, 2,500 Facebook group discussions over time, okay? We started doing analysis on the issue of accountability and transparency. And our approach to the analysis was, let's see what is people saying about these topics. Okay, this was a priority in the country. Let's see what people say about it. And we tried, and we tried, and we tried. And then we realized, and this happens a lot when you're doing real experimentation to do real innovation, that it was not that useful. So trying to understand what people were saying about these topics was not telling us much. You know, there were other type of studies, very nicely done. I'm not saying all surveys are not good. Some surveys are extremely useful. And there were other surveys. There was a survey at the time that was really having very good insights. So we realized that's not useful. But, and again, this happens a lot with experimentation. You might not find what you're looking for, but you might find something else. So what we found that I was interested in the context of Somalia at the time of the analysis in Somalia, again, very contextual, time frame and the area of work, we realized that what was interesting for conflict prevention and peace building in doing analysis on social media was the analysis of what we call the influencers. You know, the influences in social media about clothes and things like that. We say, well, we realize it's the same happening in Somalia. In the context of Somalia, we identify that there are groups that are trying to influence society through discussions on social media, through promotion and things on social media. Another question is that if they affect or not, and we had a conversation yesterday about this with some media experts, do they have an effect and an impact? I don't know. But that they are trying, we saw that, okay? So we realized this analysis of influences can be relevant. Who are promoting discussions on corruption and accountability? When are these discussions promoted? And who are they mentioning? And most of the discussions were about politicians, number one. Number two, we realized that in the context of Somalia for that time frame, what was relevant also was to identify fake Facebook groups and fake news. And we realized that most of fake news released by these fake Facebook groups were about cases of corruption involving politicians, okay? And third, we realized that what was useful was to identify trending topics in public conversations. Facebook users in Somalia at the time we did the analysis were mainly youth, mainly in urban areas, of course literate people, but it was like, okay, what is all these people talking about? What's their interest, you know? So that was found to be useful. So this is in the case of Somalia. Let me now move to Uganda. So in Uganda, what we've been doing for quite a while now is what we call radio mining. Now, in terms of the technology, this is quite different and much more complex, much, much more complex. Why is it complex? Because it involves transcription software for local languages, okay? You know this software that you speak on the phone, the Siri, and it writes for you? So that's for English. So the transcription from audio to text is for English. But for local languages in Africa, it didn't exist, but we did it. We did it with partners in academia, mainly in Stellenbosch University. So we have developed the transcription software for Luganda, Acholi, and Somali languages right now. And then we build the technology to do from radio flow streaming to transcription to data mining to analysis. So that's a lot of software altogether and a lot of time investment. So the amazing thing is that it works. Never thought it would work, but it does work. And what we have done is we focus on a topic of refugees and host communities' reactions to refugees. This is just an example of the technology. So what you see here, this is how audio look like in blue. And you see, so floats comes from that. So this is more or less what the transcription software is doing, okay? So we focus on the topic of refugees. Why? Because in Uganda, since July 2016, from one day to another, thousands of refugees, mainly from South Sudan, started fleeing the country. And that continued on a daily basis for a really long time. So there was a request in the UN system to analyze what were the hosting communities saying about it, if something, you know, to check if there was any sign of emerging conflict. So we did analysis over time with the radio deployment in two main areas of the country, in the central region and in the northern region of Uganda. We estimate that the analysis we conducted was of an average of 9,000 people speaking on the radio on a daily basis in these two regions. And this is based on the analysis of 92 radio stations out of the 250 in the country. So really a lot of time to understand the data. So now we have a good sense of how people use the radio in Uganda, how people is speaking in Uganda. So it's estimated that 25,000 people speak publicly in Uganda on the radio, and the way people use it is as social media. People talk about everything in Uganda. This is talk shows, and people talk about opinions, reports, anything that happens in the village. It's really across the country. So what we realized, this is just an example of this analysis. We conducted this analysis over time and in very specific different moments. So for example, we started analysis like 3 days after the influx of refugees, thousands of people. And then 6 months later, we did the same analysis to have a comparison. And this is just a glimpse of the analysis to show you what came out of it. So what you see here was the perceptions of the hosting communities versus the refugees. On the top side, you had the main topic of conversation, and on the lower part, what people were saying was the reason for. So for example, food insecurity. There was quite some concerns about food insecurity, and people were saying it's because of the drought, okay? Not the refugees, very interesting. Then a lot of discussions about sense of insecurity, and people were saying because of the conflict in Sudan, South Sudan, people is bringing weapons, is bringing arms, we feel insecure. And then, very interesting, a lot of discussions about elephants being displaced. Because people was displaced, elephants were displaced, and elephants were destroying the crops. So again, because of the conflict in South Sudan. So this is just an example of the type of results. So what did we realize? Again, realize, okay, very interesting to do analysis of the content of what people is saying, but what about methods to analyze public radio content, large scale, that has never been done before? And in the case of Uganda, we realized that there are 3 areas that are very interesting to inform conflict early warning systems. The first one, spotting rumors and misconceptions about refugees. There were many discussions. Are the refugees pregnant when they come into the country? Do the refugees have HIV/AIDS, and we're all gonna get HIV/AIDS? So really a lot of issues about the refugees, them, and us, the hosting community. Then we also realized that it was very relevant to identify and spot conversations about incidents indicating rising social tensions. So really conflict, armed conflict, people with weapons, etc., etc. And then third, testimonials related to refugees that cause social alarm. There were quite some stories about, I'm a refugee, I've been going to this clinic and this happened to me. I'm a refugee, this happened to me. Cases that really cause social alarm, are shocking testimonials of things. Again, we know that as any other data, big data, this type of data can be biased, but the type of analysis needs to consider this bias and address it. So while all the testimonials might not be true, at an aggregated level over time can give you a sense on what's going on. Now, while doing all this, we have faced quite some ethical issues. Now, though we are applying the data privacy and protection principles that I invite you to go and check them out at UN Global Pulse, and we have used this risk assessment tool to define the type of analysis, to decide how to use the tool, still, we have faced over the years many challenges in terms of ethics and a lot of questioning around the ethics of the work we are doing. And I'm going to summarize to you the 3 main aspects that we've been always confronted with and the way we have approached them. So first, people will ask, what's the objective of the analysis? So after presenting the issue of the refugees, after all the explanation, still somebody will say, but what are you doing this for real? Like, you are in Uganda, you work in Somalia, you know, what is this for? So purpose of the analysis is always to achieve the SDGs, but there is this suspicious and this ethical question about who is using this for work, for what. So just recently, the lab was awarded, not awarded, we were nominated to receive an award from the Belgian government, very important award, and we didn't get it. It was for the radio application tool, and the explanation from the jury was this, the ethical questions around what is this for? Who is gonna use this for what? Now, the way we approach this is that this technology is not new. This technology already exists out there. So whoever wants to use it for something that is not the SDGs is using it already. Now, the analysis of this type of data, it is done already, it's not new. You know, I remember my times in Afghanistan, in the radio room, there was always somebody listening to the radio. You know, so monitoring of radio for security approach is a normal practice. So this is not new. What we are doing is to bring this technology for the SDGs. But still, we get all this questioning always. Then another ethical question that we're confronted with normally is there informed consent by the people to analyze their voices? Did you ask them? To which we respond. For Facebook, when you join a Facebook group, when you create or when you join a Facebook group, public, there are 3 settings on privacy. So when you click the privacy setting that is open, you are agreeing for people to see and to read the way I see it and to analyze what you are saying. So you are accepting it. In the terms of radio conversations, the way I see it, when you are phoning in to participate in a public discussion, in a public forum, you are agreeing for somebody to listen to you and to analyze eventually. The thing is that this never happened before. And what we are doing is completely in line with the regulation in Uganda. So still we are confronted with this issue. And I'm mentioning this because, again, with the experimentation process and innovation, if there is something really new, you're going to get a lot of questioning. And third, is the analysis anonymous? And is there any risk of re-identification. Because sometimes people will put a name, will mention a location, people will report, for example, in the radio, in this county, this name county, this official, and the name is always drunk, is not working. So what we do is to anonymize the data. We never analyze any data that is not anonymized, and we're very sure that there is no re-identification. But it took us quite some time to define the human analysis part and the machine analysis part to do all this anonymization and no re-identification. So it is work, and it took us quite some time to define all the measures and to put them in place. So these 3 points. And I want to end now with conclusions in terms of the process of the discovering new data sources and applying them in different ways, discovering methods for conflict prevention and peace building. The way I see it, our conclusions is that the data is very valuable. The data of public discussions on Facebook and radio is very, very valuable because mainly because it's anonymous and it's unconstrained. There is no filter from anybody asking. There is no expectation. It's not a reporting system. It's not like crowdsourcing that people is reporting to. It's just unconstrained, completely unconstrained. And I believe in the value of it. Then another conclusion is that the methods to analyze small data to inform SDG 16 cannot be applied to big data. The methods and the mindset. If we look at big data the same way we look at small data, it will never be representative, it will ever be too biased. Well, it's different. So it's not meant to be representing anything, it's not meant, and it has bias that you need to correct, like any other data. Third, new tools to make this data and methods accessible are needed. Not anybody has the time to spend years I have spent now to understand big data and artificial intelligence, so new tools are needed. And in the lab we have developed a new tool, right now is for UR partners, it's called Catalog, and what it allows the user is to do data mining of both radio and Facebook with a very user-friendly interface. So no need to know data mining or anything like that, and you can do radio mining and social media mining. We're just testing it with users in the UN system now. The next point, next conclusion, innovative legal frameworks on data privacy and protection are needed, and ethics around the use of artificial intelligence are needed to be in place, and we're working in that front also. And my last conclusion, that a main advantage of this type of analysis, especially in places where there is instability, is the security and the lowering the risk exposure. Basically, this type of analysis can be done from anywhere. In this case, in Mogadishu, if you've been there, you can't leave the compound, basically, that is just next to the airport, but you can do monitoring what people are saying in public discussions from anywhere, or even from here, you can also do it. So that has a lot of advantage for the personnel on the ground. And with this, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks ever so much. That was really fascinating. Before we move on to the next presentation, I just want to see if there are any questions that you'd like to put to Paula, any elucidation required. I can see a hand at the back there. Do we have a microphone?
Thank you so much. It was a fascinating presentation and we learned a lot. My question relates to how you use the results. So do you have maybe any insights or examples of how this analysis actually informed policymakers, or what has changed? Thank you.
Second question here, if you can bring the mic over here in the front. You can stand up so we can find you.
Yeah, thanks, it's a great presentation. Just about one of the last points you made, that big data and small data, and So you can just discard representation issues and all kind of methodological thinking that goes into analyzing what you call small data, like representative samples and so on. So I would wonder, how would you kind of describe the relationship between, because obviously there are a lot of methodological challenges with whom these people represent on the radio and stuff like that. So how you see the relationship between, should we be continuing doing surveys and supplementing it with what you are doing, or how you see this going forward? Yeah, thanks.
One last question.
Hello. Thank you, Paula, for the fantastic presentation. My question to you would be, I come from Sudan, and for us, the focus for us is conflict prevention in those areas where people are poor and very vulnerable, and usually where the telecom infrastructure is not available. And the two examples that you gave here are dependent on telecom infrastructure. What kind of big data sources would you advise to tap into for us, innovate, to really go into conflict prevention and develop early warning mechanisms?
There'll be time for more questions and discussion, but I just wanted to give Paolo a chance to respond to those three.
Thank you. The question on the results, the way I see it, we don't own the results. And that's why I didn't present much this time, because we don't own them. The lab is doing the technology, is building new technology to help users to do their own analysis. So the change in the approach that we have right now is the development of this tool that we call Catalog, so that the user can do the analysis. What we've been doing is been experimenting in order to understand the data and then being able to build the tools. Most of the work we have done is internal for the UN country team, so I have many results of different analysis over the years of both Facebook analysis and radio, but they don't belong to UN Global Poll, so that's the reason why publicly and in web stream presentation, not doing it, but I'm happy to show more in details. Then the issue of the smaller big data, I'm a geographer, so I'm obsessed with representativeness. So I'm not saying it's not important, okay? What I'm saying is that I have come to realize now that the data is different. So the way I see it as a geographer. So this will be reality, okay? So, and then we say, okay, I want data from this reality. I'm gonna do data primary collection. How do I do? Surveys, and surveys are excellent for different purposes. Okay, and I want from this reality, this territory, so I want a tool that is gonna help me having all the representation. So that's a survey, beautiful, you know? The way I see big data is that big data is just happening in this reality. It might happen from a very small percentage of the population. In the case of Somalia, for example, Facebook users, very small percent of the population, male, living in urban areas, literate population. You're not gonna find a poor rural women using, no. But so what? The question is, can this data that is happening in this reality tell me something? That's the approach. So that's why I say it's a different way to look at things. The way I see the most valuable things that brings is the timing, so it's a continuous flow. Now we need the methods to realize how can this be useful for me, okay? So on what thematic areas and for what? So in the case of early warning system for conflict prevention, I do think that it has a lot of potential. In other things, maybe not. We've done exercises in the lab, for example, time ago we did this exercise about monitoring the flows of airtime consumption as a proxy indicator of poverty, okay? Just check how much do you spend in phone calls, okay? Because an indicator of, a proxy indicator of poverty in the country is airtime in the surveys, okay? So we said, okay, we can do it with real data. And we realized it was way too biased because people has different SIM cards, because one whole village will share one SIM card, so the result will tell you there's a very rich person calling a lot. No, it's the whole village, you know? So we realized, well, it's too biased and it's not telling us much, you know, because the premise was, can we identify shocks in populations linked to fluctuations on airtime consumption? No, we can't. Next, fine, you know? So it's all about finding what for. And then the last question, Anisha, about the telecom. So in this case, what I presented, Facebook, yeah, Facebook, you access it through the phone, through internet. But radio, no. There are 250 radios in Uganda. Most of them are community radios. And this is what everybody's using. Of course, there is a bias because you need to be outspoken. You need to like talking in public and saying, this is my opinion, or 3 cows died by lightning in my village. You might, so of course, then you need to have money to call the radio station and time to spend it like that, you know. But still, if you think about it, can the public discourse of 25,000 people daily speaking in Uganda, can it tell me something? Well, maybe not, but what about looking into it? So that's why I say it's a change in the way of looking at it. In what you're saying about the unconnected, so to say, in rural areas, well, the way I see it is first, what's the data gap? That's the starting point. What's your data gap? Once you are clear in what's your data gap, then it's looking at the signs, you know? So what are the signs? I don't know because I don't know. But we can look into it together. What's your data gap? Is it a territory, the data gap? Is it a population group, the data gap? Is it a thematic area? What's your data gap? It's a timing issue. So what's the data gap? And then look into the reality and look for the signs. What digital sign? And maybe there is none. Fine. You know what I mean? So I'm not saying this is the solution. I'm just saying this data is out there. So it's about understanding how we can use it.
Thanks so much. Hold your questions. I've seen that some of you still have questions. Of course you've got questions. If you haven't, why are you here? But we're going to move on to the next presentation now, and then we'll have a chance for more discussion. So I'd like to hand over to Bob from Forensic Architects, and hopefully the technology will hang in there with you.
Thank you very much. Okay, this one. Okay. Is that good like that? Yeah, okay, great. Hi there, everyone. My name is Bob Trafford. I'm a journalist by training, and for the last 2 years I've worked for an organisation called Forensic Architecture. I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. But I'm very pleased that I've followed Paula here, because I think there are some really interesting currents that I can continue. I'm going to be taking you from big data back down to small data, in some cases very small. But I think there's some real continuation in this idea that there is an awful lot of information out there, there is a lot of data out there, and what a lot of us are lacking at the moment are the tools to properly interpret that data. And I'm going to apply that idea, to very small data sets. So Forensic Architecture is a human rights investigations agency. We're based at the University of London. We produce evidence for national and international legal forums, including the ICC, and for civil society processes such as citizens' tribunals, truth commissions, and indeed certain, in the past, UN conventions. We're commissioned by legal teams, human rights groups, NGOs, activists, communities, practically any part of civil society. The only people we won't work for are states and militaries. We use very innovative techniques in both the production of our evidence and the presentation of our evidence. Some of those techniques I'll take you on a whistle-stop tour now. We use forensic image and video analysis, as in this case, assembling videos and images and camera positions in digital space. What you're seeing there is an enormous digital model. And in this case, we were investigating Israel's 2014 assault on the city of Rafah in Gaza, and we were able to support conclusions by Amnesty International that multiple specific violations of international humanitarian law had occurred during that assault. We also recreate crime scenes as physical models as well as digital models. In this case, we were investigating the 2006 murder by neo-Nazis of a young Turkish immigrant in southern Germany, and exploring the question of why a German state intelligence officer had been sat in the next room while the murder occurred and not intervened. We also rely very heavily, almost exclusively, on what is called open source information. That is information that's in the public domain, on social media, in government records, and images, including satellite imagery. And what you're seeing here is an image from our investigation into the quite famous disappearance of 43 students in Iguala in Mexico in 2014, in which multiple state agencies were heavily implicated. This is, in fact, a visualization of thousands of pages of publicly available information, data mined and visualized within an interactive web platform, which is, of course, based around a satellite image of the town of Iguala. So we focus on instances of state violence against civilians or in conflict, usually where the involvement of a state in the act of violence precludes that state from adequately investigating or prosecuting the perpetrators, often because those perpetrators are themselves state agents. And one of the central problems of conducting investigations into state violence is that the state controls the rules of evidence and courtroom procedure. And this requires us to operate across a number of different forums. What you're seeing here is our work exhibited at the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London. We find artistic spaces and cultural institutions are a very valuable way for us to navigate around the strictures of legal procedures, particularly when state bodies are the defendants. So we're required to exist in a space between journalism, human rights advocacy, forensics, the law, art, and aesthetics. And undoubtedly the growth of FA, excuse me, using the shorthand already, forensic architecture, if I slip into that, you know what I mean, I'm not talking about the Football Association. Undoubtedly our growth has been assisted and accelerated by the presence of a set of conditions that makes our work particularly necessary. And I want to talk a little bit about what those conditions are. We've developed and grown in response to a number of phenomena. The first is the urbanization of conflict. As here in Syria, more so than anywhere else, but across the world, cities have become battlefields. And the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure has become routine in a way that I think it's fair to say is unprecedented, with some qualifications. The second is the ubiquity of smartphones and digital recording, which ensures that battlefields and sites and acts of violence have never been more thoroughly documented. You know, we have citizen journalists everywhere in conflict zones now. We have soldiers and spies using social media, and often very badly. We have freely available satellite imagery. So the evidence of violence is really everywhere when an institution develops the ability to see it. And as I said at the top, I think what I mean in this case, in respect of our work, is that the evidence of violence can be there in very small data sets, in individual images, in where people are posting material from. And I just wanted to highlight that contrast to, perhaps to Paula's work on finding valuable information in big data sets. Now, the response of many states to this sort of panoptic documentation of violence has been to encourage something that our director likes to call the insurgency against truth. And what has become common currency now for the new cohort of autocrats that we're seeing across the world is a tendency, which again is enabled by a certain set of political and social circumstances, including actually, perversely, the availability of an enormous amount of visual information, an enormous amount of images, without the accompanying mainstreaming of image literacy in society. There's an awful lot of image and video material out there, and quite a lot of the time we're not sure what we're looking at. And those circumstances, that particular circumstance and others, have enabled autocratic regimes, states and militaries to attack not only the truth of a particular incident, did a chemical attack occur here or not, but the very possibility of establishing truth, whether there is even truth out there to be found. And in telling you a little bit about our efforts and our ways of working, I want to give you an overview of what some of those modern ways of establishing those truths can be. Now, this dual violence, which is committed by states, which is both against people and then subsequently against facts and against truth and against evidence, demands a number of things from civil society. Not only that a technical forensic capacity should exist outside of state authority, but that we should begin to understand truth and verification both as a commons, as a kind of resource that society needs to function healthily, like air or water, but also as a practice. Truth should be considered a practice, not a monolithic, objective absolute that exists elsewhere and needs to be accessed or proven or denied, confirmed or otherwise. Truth has to be something that civil society at all levels does together. This is something our director calls network-based verification. And it's a means of arriving at the truth that is cross-referenced, that is mutually supporting, and that explicitly involves community making, partnership with and among communities affected by state violence and activists and their supporters on the ground. And in the context of today's presentation, what we've heard from Julie's framing, this is exactly social cohesion. This is truth building as a kind of glue, as a social glue. So in the brief time that I have left to speak to you, I want to share with you a few examples of the practical possibilities created for civil society, rather, by the prevalence of images and videos, as well as the strength of community making when it comes to evidence and some of the possible ways forward for human rights reporting and advocacy. I want to start here in Syria. This is the Damascus suburb of Douma, because it's in the aftermath of the kinds of chemical weapons attacks that occurred earlier this year here in April 2018, that this kind of insurgency against truth is commonly deployed. It becomes very visible. So here, transparent against a digital model of the scene of the attack, is the image of a Russian TV journalist reporting with their usual glee on the potential holes and questions that they found in the crime scene of this alleged chemical weapons attack. Following the surrender of the rebels in Douma very shortly after this attack, Russian journalists were the first to be allowed to the scene by the Syrian regime. There's no surprise there. And they reported with dutiful skepticism on the suggestion that this canister had ever contained chlorine gas. This is despite a wealth of visual information, videos, and image material that arrived on social media showing people suffering the symptoms of exactly that. But why I wanted to start with this case is because it's exactly this video material captured by these journalists endeavoring to show that an attack had not happened that gave us the means to undercut their claim that the attack was staged. You'll see here, highlighted in blue, oh excuse me, I've jumped ahead. Highlighted in blue at the back here is a sort of twisted metal object that we've highlighted in our model. You'll see it again here at the bottom of the frame. Now if I skip forward again, you'll see that we've recomposed that object using architectural modeling techniques. And you might begin to get a picture of what it is now. This twisted metal blue object that is sat behind this Russian journalist as he's reporting on the fact that this canister has been carried here by rebels to make it look as if the Syrian regime is attacking its own civilians with chemical weapons, is in fact the delivery mechanism that the Syrian regime have used to do so. Here it is again. This is a flight harness. This is used to deliver chlorine gas canisters to the ground. So this is just one example, and within the frame of that, the image of the Russian journalist, there were 3 or 4 more examples of very specific pieces of visual, physical evidence that in fact showed that the things that they were recording themselves saying in the same frame of the video were not true and could not be true. Okay, I'm going to go on now to show you a short video of an investigation that we did in Cameroon on behalf of Amnesty International. I want to discuss this investigation as an example of what can occur when traditional on-the-ground human rights reporting and research and advocacy and interviewing is married to the kind of technical capacity that forensic architecture can offer, but also to more simple open source intelligence techniques. And I should say that whenever I'm showing sort of complicated architectural modeling techniques on screen, I am to some degree aping the work of other people in my office. I'm not an architect and I can't do digital modeling. I'm an open source investigative journalist and a researcher. So I want to show you this project because this is more onto my home turf. This is what can happen when the on-the-ground work that field researchers do is married to the information that's already available online and the results that that can achieve. So to set the scene quickly, we were asked by Amnesty International to investigate allegations of torture and extrajudicial killing at a military base in the north of Cameroon. The sort of conflict context is the Cameroonian security forces ongoing skirmishes with Boko Haram along the Cameroonian-Nigerian border in around 2016, we're talking here. Now, in the course of this investigation, we uncovered something that testimony had only hinted at, and we uncovered this through open source research, and it allowed us to leverage a great deal of leverage against the Cameroonian security forces, and we hope began to wrap up this program of the torture and killing of civilians that was apparently carrying on with impunity at this particular base until this time. Okay, I think we can roll the video, please.
At the heart of the international coalition fighting Boko Haram is Cameroon's elite Rapid Intervention Battalion, known as the BIR. Amnesty International has documented more than 100 cases of torture committed by Cameroon's security forces since 2013. At Salak, illegal detention and torture take place with the likely knowledge of the BIR's senior command, including in places that are accessible and could be visible to US and other foreign personnel. Detainees saw foreign personnel from their cells.
We will see them and they will see us. We look at the cells from where they are. I saw white men in Salak many times. Everyone said they were Americans, and we knew American soldiers stocked material in Salak. I saw them jogging from the back window of my cell, as well as standing in front of our cell, just where the garage was.
Tendering documents from December 2013 support witness testimonies describing a US presence in Salak. Until now, the US presence at Salak has gone unreported. Photographs posted onto social media by US personnel confirm their presence throughout Salak. Here, US personnel are seen training BIR soldiers. In this clip, US and BIR personnel are seen playing football with night vision equipment. We cross-referenced the reported locations of US soldiers, the locations of US personnel's social media photographs, the places where detainees are held, and those places where detainees are tortured.
So we're going to return to that map. Oops, Amnesty's got a bit of free advertising. Move on from that. We're going to return to that map at the end of the video shortly, but I just want to talk about a little bit about how we got there. So what you have at the top here are some hand-drawn images drawn by people who experienced torture and violence and detention in Salak. And here we have some aerial images of the site. One is a sort of a zoom in of the other. So one of our first steps was to try and make these two maps fit together. And you can see broadly you have a sort of a row of 4 buildings across the top here, which correspond to these on the left-hand side. And from there, we begin to fit information that witnesses have told us and that comes from testimony with what we can see from publicly available information. And then we went further and we said, well, what do we find if we start to type things like Salak into Google? And I'm not going to say it was exactly that simple, but it was. This stuff doesn't have to be hard. Well, when you start typing names of Cameroonian military bases into Google, you might begin to find things like contracts which tie US special forces to that base, which indeed we did. And by using very simple Facebook searching tools, I was able to find photos taken by a US military contractor. He'd been posted out to this base to fly drones for the US Special Forces. He obviously wanted to send some photos to his family at home, and he hadn't either used his Facebook privacy settings or turned his geolocation off. So this one was kind of a free hit because it sort of walked right up to us. And what do we begin to find? Well, we begin to be able to piece together the testimony that we've been given, that people said they saw white people in Salak, that there was a building called the Americans Building. We begin to be able to piece that together with what we see here. At the bottom, you'll see a labeled map that we sent back digitally to former detainees of Salak, now in the Cameroonian judicial system. We numbered this, and we marked it up for them, and we said, can you tell us specifically what these buildings were and what they were used for? So not only are we using open source information to push the investigation in new ways, which ultimately lead to the kind of leverage which I mentioned, but we're also feeding open source information back into the traditional human rights witnessing, interviewing, advocacy process to push the results further in a different way. Do I have more slides related to that? Yes, okay, so here we are. So the end result of this investigation was this map. And I talked about both the production and the presentation of our evidence. We're coming on to the presentation now. What we were able to do, looking at this map, was to say, well, if red is sites of torture and blue is where the Americans were, then the very least we can say is that American personnel, that rather, let's do it the other way around, that torture occurred in areas that are visible to and accessible to US personnel. And in this case, open source information opened up a brand new avenue for us. We were able to take these allegations to the US State Department, to the Pentagon. We published articles in the US news website, The Intercept. And the results were quite astonishing. I mean, you know, we're a small organization, and for civil society to counterpunch against state violence is very difficult, and the results are limited and few. In this case, the US military, the Pentagon, launched an internal inquiry into whether their soldiers had known about this. I mean, they're special forces, so you'd expect them to be fairly bright sparks, fairly aware. And they're also, as we know, training the very same soldiers who are alleged to have conducted this torture. What else did it lead to? Also, the cessation of military aid from the US to Cameroon pending the outcome of these inquiries. So I wanted to present this investigation to you because what it shows is that when we combine what we might consider fairly traditional field research, going and speaking to people who've suffered violence at the hands of states, talking